Hello and welcome back to Beyond Networks, the evolution of living systems. In last module, one of the two core modules of this course, after the one with the organisms, I tried to paint a picture of how complex evolution really is if we consider not only the consequences of the variation, but also the sources of the variation that selection can act on. I introduced this idea of radical openness and sort of the rules changing all the time, and tried to show you how you can get truly emergent innovation from this sort of process. At the very end, we took a quick glimpse at how the interactions of the organism then with its environment, its perceived environment, increase the complexity of the problem even more. Everything, the constraints and the processes within the organism and the perceived environment, the affordances in that environment, and the organism itself co-evolve and co-generate each other in this sort of dialectic process that is not just reciprocal causation. It's not two independent processes influencing each other, but it is co-generation. So these processes, they generate, they necessitate each other for their very existence. So this is mind-boggling. I was also trying to argue that we don't have the modeling tools or the conceptual tools really yet to think about this sort of dynamic. And so we could just throw up our hands in the air and say, we cannot understand this process. Everything is radically context dependent. History is very important. All we can do is write history here in terms of evolutionary history. But I don't think that's the case. So in this module, we want to sort of take a deep breath and simplify everything again. So I want to take a really serious perspectivist approach here to evolutionary biology. I want to examine how different people have simplified evolutionary theory, how their assumptions enables insights, but also limits them. And then I want to examine how we can compare the different perspectives and maybe learn more about how robust and how applicable our insights into evolution are, and in which kind of cases they apply and when they do not. So in this spirit, we're going to sort of contract everything I said in the last module to this very minimal view of evolution that I introduced a few lectures ago, which is described here by Richard Lewontin, who's sort of trying to condense the very essence of Darwinian evolutionary theory into these three principles of phenotypic variation, fitness differences in a population, and the fact that those phenotypic differences that cause fitness differences are inherited across generations. Simplifying these even further, we have Elliot Sober, who writes all of this in just one sentence, which he calls the Darwinian general principle. If there is heritable variation in fitness, then there will be evolution. This is evolution by natural selection, of course. Okay, so this is extremely simple, but this one sentence packs a punch. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this sentence apart in different ways and see what kind of consequences that has. And one way of taking it apart is to subdivide the process of evolution by natural selection, which consists of those three component processes that Lewontin defined, into different stages instead of different processes. And this was first done by Ernst Mayr in his textbook in 1978 on evolution. And he says, okay, what's happening here is you have two different aspects of evolution by natural selection. One is selection itself, which changes the distributions of types, genotypes, phenotypes, whatever you want, within generations. Some survive, some don't. Some reproduce, some don't. And then the second stage of the process is that of the actual reproduction, which maps type distributions across generations according to their degree of heritability. Of course, that's inheritance in Lewontin's view. Very simple two-step process. But it's not enough. Because, as philosopher Robert Brandon pointed out in 1990 in his book, Adaptation and Environment, this doesn't really close that intergenerational circle that we call sort of the life cycle, which is what's actually evolving. And Brandon argues that you need to introduce a third essential process here, very much in the spirit of the causal completeness idea, and that is development, because differing offspring genotypes must develop to close the circle. We're going to develop over the next few lectures a notion of what kind of development we need for such a minimal notion of evolution. But basically, the argument here is that if you do not have development, you will not translate the genotypes that are propagated through the generations, across the generations, into phenotypes that selection can act on. And so there's a causal gap between Meyer's two stages. Okay, very simple. The simplest sort of evolutionary theory we could probably have. These are very powerful sort of analyses. Okay, so and they're connected. Those two analyses are connected. Darwin's principles of variation, inheritance, and differential reproductive success describe the conditions for evolution by natural selection to go through all these three stages full circle. And that's what you need for evolution to happen. If you put them in the proper order, these stages constitute a process of evolution by natural selection. Here it is, evolution in a nutshell. Why do we need to worry about all the complexity I was introducing in last module? If we have this, let's think about this. So let me motivate what I'm going to do next by taking a step back all the way to module number 2. And I'm going to base not only this lecture, but actually the entire module that we're in right now on this absolutely wonderful book chapter by philosopher James Griesemer, who's a student of Bill Wimsatt's, by the way, which was published in a collection of essays called Genes in Development, edited by Eva Neumann-Held and Raymond Sutter. And so this is a massively underrated piece of writing. It's hard to find, but it's an amazing piece of work for two reasons. So first of all, James is sort of looking at specific different perspectives. We're going to go through them one after the other. But the other thing that he does is that he motivates perspectivism, specifically in the context of evolution, in this paper. And he says, theoretical perspectives, their purpose is to focus attention on particular aspects of particular phenomena. So what we're going to do is we're going to take different perspectives on this very minimal model of evolution by natural selection that I introduced. They commit limited resources to model phenomena in particular ways. Okay, so they are necessary because we're limited in time and in intellectual capacity. They specify preferred principles of model construction and lines of abstraction idealization. So we cannot just deal with the complexity of evolution. We can just acknowledge it and sit there and hug a tree, but we cannot understand it that way. We need to deal with it somehow, and that requires abstraction and idealization. Okay, and of course, perspectives allow us to prioritize interventions. What kind of experiments should we do? Okay, so perspectives make the problem tractable. And James writes that I argue that a variety of theoretical perspectives on entities, structures, functions, fields, events, and processes is needed in order to achieve a robust account of biology's theoretical units. Okay? I therefore urge a change of philosophical focus from choice among rival perspectives to comparative analysis of strengths, weaknesses, and complementarities. We need a diversity of perspective to understand evolution from as many different angles as possible. So the units we're talking about here are the units of heredity, development, evolution, also units of selection. We're going to come back to that in a minute. Basically, what he's saying here, and that will be the topic of a big topic in next module, is we should not strive for an evolutionary synthesis. We should strive for as many perspectives as possible, because the complexity and the diversity of evolutionary biology and evolution requires that sort of approach. And also that we should not see those perspectives as something that competes. They don't compete among each other, but they complement each other. And actually, by analyzing the differences between the different perspectives, we get what Wimsatt calls robustness analysis. We get an insight not only into the limitations of each perspective and their particular uses, but also of those sort of phenomena that are robust across perspectives, and we can trust more than other kinds of insight that we may have on evolution. Okay, so a lot of text here, but this is how James puts it. Science works best when it produces empirical results that are robust to theoretical assumptions, those that stay valid across perspectives. Thus, a multiplicity of perspectives can add to the knowledge base of science by fostering a variety of research programs into different phenomena, as well as deepen and secure that knowledge by facilitating robust results. We get more insight and we get more robust insight from taking different perspectives. So, how do you distinguish formally different perspectives? How can we start analyzing them in a rigorous way? There, James suggests a particular sort of basis for each perspective, which is rooted in what they assume to be the state space of their models. He writes, families of models developed under different perspectives are distinguished by the kinds of state spaces they assume for representation of component states and processes. That's very abstract. So let's become a bit more concrete. So the processes he's talking about are classical Darwinian processes, Lewontin's selection, reproduction, and development, for example. The choice of state, what we look at, determines the kind of guiding perspectives. I'll give you a lot of examples in just a little bit. Individuals or populations are represented by points in the state space. So evolutionary models describe the change of individuals or populations over time. And so they represent the states, and processes that cause state transformations, evolutionary change, are represented as trajectories in the space. Now, the different perspectives differ in the way they represent the state space and the sort of features they focus on. So let's look at the first example of this, an example from classical population genetics. And here is Sewell Wright, famous American population geneticist, who introduced this idea of an adaptive landscape to evolutionary theory in a very famous 1932 paper in Genetics. So Sewell Wright is drawing these landscapes by hand, which is great. So basically you have, these are like maps. So you have contours here, and you have troughs and peaks in the landscape that are designated by pluses and minuses here. And what he does in this paper, he goes, so the state space, I should say first, is a genotype space. And what he does is he maps individual genotypes onto this space. And the height of the landscape corresponds, of course, to the fitness of each individual genotype. And so you can have draw different evolutionary scenarios in here. You can see that in the different panels here. There are different assumptions about mutation rates and population sizes, and so you can find different dynamics of evolution under these different assumptions, which he draws here as these trajectories in this landscape. We don't have to worry about the particular scenarios, but what's important is you see this scenario leads to a very sort of small spread of genotypes in a very small location here. This one leads to a bigger spread, but gets there through a much more random but much less wiggly path, right? So these are the evolutionary trajectories of the population. And of course, it's highly idealized, but this is the classic example of an evolutionary model with a well-defined state space and states. Okay, so let us sort of take 4 different perspectives in the rest of this module on evolutionary dynamics. And 3 of those are described in James's paper. I'm going to follow those. And then the 4th one comes again from Dennis Walsh in his book, Organisms, Agency, and Evolution. So the first sort of perspectives are structural, kind of functional perspectives on evolution, process perspectives, and then last but not least, an agential perspective based on this assumption that organisms have goals and pursue them. They have affordances in their perceived environment. The sort of framework we built up in the last lecture of the last module. But first, the rest of this lecture will focus in on the first two of them, and we'll start, of course, with a structural perspective that comes from Lewontin himself, and actually this paper in 1970, where he introduces his minimalist definition of Darwinian principles. Okay, and the most important thing, the topic of that paper is, what is a unit of selection? Where does selection actually happen, right? It doesn't happen directly. The genes, where does it happen? And so we have to acknowledge that there is a compositional hierarchy. Remember WIMSAT, so there are different levels of organization in an organism and beyond. I'm just showing you up to the organismic level here, from atoms to molecules to macromolecules, organelles, cells, tissues, organ systems, organisms, and then of course demes, populations, ecosystems, etc. So we can look at the level at which evolution is happening, selection is happening, if we want to find out what is evolving. What is the unit of selection? What is selection actually working on? And so Lewontin introduces these three criteria. He says selection acts at a specific level of organization when there is variation at that level, there is heritability across generations, and there is differential reproduction. Okay, you wouldn't have expected that, right? So basically, this is just his minimalist Darwinist scheme put at different levels. And so the analysis tries to apply these principles and say, wherever these three principles apply, we get evolution by natural selection. So to get back to this sort of hierarchical composition, which is of course a structural perspective, in the sense that we look at the structure, the hierarchical composition of an organism. He says, okay, so the genetic units are at the lower or lowest level actually of this hierarchy in terms of the relevance to evolution. Plus there are higher levels of hierarchically organized phenotypic units on which selection can act. So this sort of theory extends Darwin's theory, because Darwin only considered the level of the organism itself. Darwin's evolutionary theory is not about genes. He didn't know about genes. Darwin's evolutionary theory is only about organisms. And so this is extending it and basically examining how does genetic evolution relate to phenotypic evolution at different levels of the compositional hierarchy. It guides studies of multi-level selection, okay? So it is possible, we want to know at which levels selection is happening, okay? But it has a big blind spot. It takes this compositional hierarchy for granted. So if you're interested in how multicellular life evolved, a major evolutionary transition, remember? This perspective won't help you because it simply assumes that this is what we have. And it needs to assume it. So Lewontin's most famous diagram from this perspective was printed in his 1974 textbook, The Genetic Basis for Evolutionary Change. And it's a mapping between two different state spaces. Okay, so he says you need to look at the interplay between phenotypic evolution. You need two different levels. This is one of the origins, apart from Jim Burns, this idea of genotype-phenotype mapping. But the mapping here is quite complex. It's broken down into 4 different transformational laws that represent the 3-step process of natural selection that Brandon crystallized in his book later on, after Lewontin published this diagram, of course. So let's look at those 4 different processes that are denoted by T's here. So you have different genotypes. I'll explain what these are, and different phenotypes, G's and P's that are mapped to each other by different transformations, transformational laws. T1 represents epigenetic laws, which is development. basically it maps the genotype to phenotype. This is the abstraction of the genotype-phenotype map that we've encountered several times in this course already. The second step, these are the laws of mating, migration, and selection. Mainly, this is important. Let's just summarize it under selection. Okay, these map phenotypes before selection to phenotypes after selection. And they move in phenotype space here. And then epigenetic relations. This is a bit difficult and a bit awkward, I think. So this already shows you that there's something not quite fitting here. Epigenetic relations are kind of the inverse of development. They allow inferences about distribution of genotypes of the surviving phenotype. So you look at the phenotypic sort of distributions and you infer something about the underlying genes, which is something that we do when we do genetic mapping, of course. And then the last step, the fourth transformational law, are the genetic rules that determine the inheritance of genotypes across generations. So it maps genotypes of one generation to the next. So these four transformational laws lead to the closure of this circle. The three steps are represented here. There's development, selection, and inheritance in this sort of very complicated diagram. But there are some problems here. So one thing to notice is that evolutionary models show you how transformations happen within a given state space, but only two of the laws here fulfill this. So there's the genetic rules that determine how genes are passed on from generation to generation, and there is selection, which determines which kind of phenotypes survive, actually. So it moves the population in phenotype space. So these are classic within level processes. So they're causal, but remember that interlevel causation is a little more complicated. And so what's happening here is you have these weird mappings between the different spaces, one of which definitely is not causal. These epigenetic relations more have to do with our ability to infer genotypes from phenotype, while development, of course, is a causal process. It happens between the state spaces. So there's something wrong. We're not quite cutting reality by its joints here, if you want to put it that way. And what's more, there's a problem with the way that development is represented here. It's really awkward to represent development in this. Because if you think about it, development is not just genotype to phenotype mapping in a straight way like it is represented here. It is actually mapping genotypes to a selected phenotype, because selection is not acting on any sort of point in the life cycle of the organism. It's acting on the life cycle itself, on the processes that define ontogeny. So what is being selected are processes of development, and even broader ontogenetic processes that include unicellular organisms and not some specific adult phenotype only. So it's awkward to fit development in here. It doesn't quite fit. So evolutionary genetic models confuse the causal status of their state variables, since they depend on mappings between states, and even worse, ill-defined mappings between states. This mapping doesn't quite map onto reality, really. So this type of representation facilitates formalization of selection and inheritance, because they are well defined, they happen within their state spaces, but complicates the representation of developmental transformation. It's not a very good framework to look at the evolution of development or the role of development in evolution. And in fact, it puts a blind spot to that. It's not a good framework. It excludes it without examining it in any sort of detail. Okay, so these are the limitations and the uses. Structural perspectives are about compositional hierarchy, about units of selection, about multi-level selection processes. Let's take another account, and this is sort of the most fundamental reductionist account to evolution that we're going to talk about. So the example for a functional perspective that I'm going to give you is the replicator-interactor perspective, propagated by Richard Dawkins, popularizer of science, and David Hull, who is a philosopher, or was a philosopher. So they say these units of selection, okay, what kind of role do they play in evolution? We're not interested in what kind of structures they are, like Lewontin was in his analysis. We are interested in what is the function that these units play. And they say there's exactly two roles. Actually, Dawkins initially says there's only one. We'll come back to that. There's the role of the replicator, and there's the role of the interactor that David Hull introduced. Okay, so replicators are simply, in Dawkins' view, entities of which copies are made. Very simple. Hull has a bit more, he's a philosopher, so he has a bit more words. He says entities which transmit their structure directly and relatively intact in replication. So this is more precise, but there's a problem with the definition. Hold that in your mind. We'll come back to it in just a second. Let's look at the interactor definition first. What are interactors? These are entities which interact directly with their external environments, because genes don't. They don't interact. So you interact with your environment, not your genes. Your phenotype does. They interact with the environment in such a way that replication is differential. So some of our phenotypes are more successful than others. Okay, so this is Hull's definition. Dawkins initially just dismisses this level as, our bodies, our phenotypes as vehicles for genes, basically bags that transport genes across generations. So look at both of these definitions. What's wrong here? They are both circular. Replicators are things that replicate. Interactors are things that interact. Okay? All right. So this is the simplest caricature of evolution you can get. It's the simplest perspective, and it is useful for certain things, but it's very, very limited. Okay, so let's look at it in a bit more detail. Here is a beautiful diagram long before actually Dawkins or Hull formulated this theory in more detail. Maynard Smith, in his book On Evolution in 1972, drew this diagram where he basically encapsulates the entire gist of the theory already. And so what you see here is it looks complicated, it's very simple. There are different processes, and the arrows are supposed to sort of represent causal interactions or material continuity. So for example, here you have a line of genotype. G means genotype. These are replicators in the sense of Dawkins and Hull. They're propagated through the germline from one generation to the other. These are the genes that are passed on between generations. And they produce, through some sort of genetic program in this very reductionist view, of course, the interactors that are then interacting with the environment. And replicators that have an influence on the phenotype, on the interactor, are called active replicators. So we have active germline replicators here. They interact with the environment through the interactors here. You can see the arrows here. The environment is sort of positively interacting with these, but also filtering certain genotypes that build interactors that are not good for survival, not fit, okay? So these replicators here are the unlucky ones. They get filtered out by the environment. These are the lucky ones they get through. And so the only role for the environment, and therefore also for the interactor, is to act as a filter for genotypes to pass on through the generations. So there's a continuity in the environment, of course, and in the germline, but not between the interactors here. And of course, not between the organisms that die during the process. Okay, so this very simple view was described by Dawkins himself as extreme Weismannism. So August Weismann was the guy who separated germline from soma, and this is what extreme Weismannism is about. It cleanly and in an extreme way separates the causal processes of inheritance here from the causal processes of development, and they play radically different roles, right? Development is just producing the interactor here. So the only role of the development here is as part of this filtering process for the germline. And so the only real replicators in this, the only real units of evolution, sorry, in this picture are the replicators, okay? Because they're the only ones, apart from the environment, which is non-living, that are passed on from generation to generation. So basically, you've gotten rid of the organism in the cleanest possible way. And this is why I like Dawkins so much. So what Dawkins and Hull do here is they provide a very explicit philosophical description of their simplifying assumptions, of their model, their idealization. So it's very easy to analyze this model. And it's actually useful because it's very simple. That's one thing. So this perspective suggests a single coherent process of evolution through time. It can't get simpler than that. This is the simplest possible model of evolution. But it has several blind spots, of course. It doesn't allow for any interaction, any causal interaction between inheritance here, this process, selection, the filtering process, and development. They're completely separated processes, okay? And of course, just like the structural account takes the compositional hierarchy for granted, it takes the existence of replicators and interactors for granted, and it doesn't explain to us how they originated. In fact, Dawkins' theory of the origin of life is very funny, not funny, funny, but it's funny because he basically says the origin of life is a miracle. It's an extremely unlikely event. He likens it to a hurricane going through a scrapyard and building a functioning airplane. While in a later book where he argues against the possibility of God existing, he uses the same argument to say it's very improbable that God exists, therefore God doesn't exist. So if he would apply the same criteria to his own theory of the origin of life, life is a miracle and shouldn't exist. Okay, so here is for Dawkins logical consistency, which isn't very great. Okay, so this is a simple caricature of evolution. So let's compare the structural and the functional perspectives on evolution by natural selection. So what is the strength of each of these perspectives? So the strength of the structural account is we can look at multi-level selection. We can find out where does selection actually happen. The strength of the replicator account, of course, is its simplicity. It works when you don't have a lot of causal interactions between inheritance, development, and selection, which happens in some cases, like monogenic traits and others. I mean, it has its applicability, it's just not very far. And so these two have their blind spots. Something really went wrong with the animations here, I'm sorry. So let's just get it all visible. Blind spots are the hierarchical composition and the genotype-phenotype distinction in each case, okay? So this means both have problems accommodating, well, that's another problem. They have problems accommodating development because development doesn't play any sort of role in evolution, of course, in the replicator account. And it has to be sort of some sort of very deterministic genetic program for it to be ignorable. But worst of all, neither analyzes the processes by which the scaffolding they assume evolved. So the very conceptual scaffold they're built on is left unassumed. And you need to have a different perspective to look at where did this sort of hierarchical composition, where did the genotype-phenotype distinction and therefore the clean separation between inheritance and development, where did this come from? It leaves it completely, it's just assumed. It's not explained. It's not investigated, it's just assumed. Okay, one more aspect of this is it should be clear by now that these two different perspectives are not in competition with each other. In fact, they build on each other, right? I mean, so the multi-level structural account allows you to identify units of selection, which you can then sort of investigate in a functional way as sort of replicators. And so they do not mutually exclude each other. And in fact, there's never been a lot of fight or a lot of discussion. There have been some debates, but no bigger conflicts among these perspectives. They provide different answers to different questions. But what we need is a way to step out of those those perspectives completely and have a sort of a triangulation, Griesemer calls it. So we have to have a third perspective that looks at them from the outside. And that is provided by different perspectives that take the process of evolution more seriously. Because you may have noticed that both of these perspectives are based on things. The unit of selection very explicitly is a thing. And replicators, of course, are things that are passed on from generation to generation. So let's switch in next lecture to this more processual approach and see what these type of, we're going to discuss two of them. One of them we've already encountered, the other one is new, and we're going to look at how these process perspectives shed new light on these perspectives, the limitations of these perspectives, the blind spots that we've discussed today. And I hope you're going to tune in again next time. And as always, thank you for listening.